Over the past 3 years, over 100,000 truck drivers have permanently lost their job and their career for testing positive for smoking weed. So this has begged the question, should professional truck drivers with their CDL be allowed to smoke weed and not be drug tested for it going forward, considering the legalization of weed in the rest of the United States as it's becoming more of a trend? This has all been in the news recently because the ATRI released a study based upon the impacts of marijuana legalization on the trucking industry. And you can see here they just released this in June. This study was prepared by the American Transportation Research Institution, or the ATRI. And a little bit about the ATRI, they basically do a bunch of different studies on different trucking topics. They're a pretty good resource and you can check them out for other things. But the American Transportation Research Institution has been engaged in critical transportation studies and operational tests since 1954, headquarters in DC. So the ATRI is a government-funded research institution. So I think we can all kind of infer that smoking weed is probably bad for a driver to do, but what would be the incentive to potentially legalize it or allow drivers to do it if the research had it make sense? So the FMCSA requires all professional drivers and carriers hiring professional drivers to conduct a pre-employment drug test. On top of this, if you're a smaller carrier, you have to enroll in a random drug testing consortium, or if you're larger, you just have to randomly drug test your drivers. Typically, this is done just peeing into a cup, or more scientifically known as a metabolite test. And basically, it is the industry's impression that there is an intense driver shortage of about 65,000 drivers right now, even in a slow market, and that if we lightened restrictions on weed and weed testing, that it would make it easier for companies to hire and more people would be incentivized to join the trucking industry. So we're going to find out if any of this makes sense. This is the official American Transportation Research Institution study on marijuana. It's about 61 pages, so I'm skipping to most of the parts that are, I think, the most relevant to save some time. So this is the DATS reported drug tests results from 2020 to 2022. So as you can see here, it's kind of a breakdown of the different drugs that employees or professional drivers are failing for on drug tests. In 57% of total positive tests, marijuana is found. So it makes up a large majority of when the drivers actually fail the test. It's typically for marijuana. So we're going to go down here. So Table 5 describes the historical progression of the number of CDL holders in the return to duty process. The FMCSA indicates that as of January 2023, there were 166,000 drivers with one or more violations, and the majority, 63% of those violations tested positive more than 1 year prior. Of the 166,000 positive test drivers, 72.6% remained prohibited status, and more than half of the drivers had never started the return to duty process. So in short, this means that well over 100,000 drivers basically failed their drug test and then never continued the career. So they were just totally done trucking, never did the return to duty process, and are just done being truck drivers for failing a drug test. And my opinion from experience is that drivers are not coming back to return to duty just because, mostly out of laziness, it's kind of a little bit of a process to come back to service. And the second reason is that most trucking companies will not consider hiring you for a while after you fail a drug test because it is too risky for their insurance and they just do not want to take the risk of having practices where they hire people who have failed drug tests. So you can see here the year by year DATS statistics for 2020 to 2022, basically the accumulation of drivers since 2021 who have got more and more drug test failures. And the exact number here that drivers are in current prohibited status is 120,000. So these are all the drivers that basically fail the test and then do not come back to service and are never truck drivers again. So the study goes into, these are all metabolite testing, so piss test. So they're claiming that because marijuana is in a metabolite test for up to 30 days or even longer, that it is testing for drivers who are not actively impaired, as compared to something like cocaine or methamphetamine, where it will only be in your system for about 1 to 5 days prior to the test. So while the current marijuana testing is very effective at removing drivers who may potentially use marijuana, it would also be effective at removing drivers who would not actively operate a truck while impaired. So then we get into the study here of marijuana and highway safety. Basically, like, how does the weed actually affect drivers and their safety and crashes, fatal and non-fatal. So research on marijuana has been difficult in the past due to federal and state laws making the drug illegal. However, funding for research has steadily grown in recent decades from $30 million in 2000 to $143 million in 2018. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed in November of 2021, may increase research and analysis for marijuana's impact on roadway safety. So basically, they're increasing a lot of the money that's going into actually researching for weed. So here on the next page, we have the impact of marijuana on vehicle drivers. So according to the Center of Disease Control, the THC contained in marijuana is a psychoactive, mind-altering compound that affects areas of the brain that control the body's movements, balance, coordination, memory, and judgment. The impacts of marijuana also include impaired coordination, distorted perception, memory loss, and problem-solving difficulties. A particular concern for those operating a motor vehicle are decision-making capabilities, as well as reaction times, which can be slowed by marijuana. So they go into some of the studies here. So one, a 2009 study which compared the impact of alcohol versus marijuana on driving found that the detrimental effects of cannabis use vary in a dose-related fashion and are more pronounced with highly automatic driving functions than with more complex tasks that require conscious control. The research indicates that a driver's awareness of being impaired by marijuana can allow the driver to compensate for that impairment. The compensation is, however, eliminated if alcohol and marijuana are combined. Ultimately, the early study found that past research is inconclusive as to whether marijuana use increases accident risk. By 2016, however, the new research found that acute cannabis intoxication is associated with a statistically significant increase in motor vehicle crash risk. Another 2017 study found that drivers under the influence of marijuana multiply their risk of being responsible for causing a fatal accident 1.65, while alcohol increased that risk by 17.8 times. So basically, they're coming down to the conclusion that smoking weed or being on marijuana at the time does increase the likelihood that you get into an accident. This part of the study is talking about the different ways to test for marijuana. So the Government Highway Safety Association indicates that every state has laws dealing with alcohol-impaired driving and drug-impaired driving, but unlike the laws for drunk driving, those that address drugged driving are nuanced, difficult to enforce, and prosecute and vary substantially by state. There are two primary approaches to document marijuana-impaired drivers. The first is behavior-based, with evidence collected through standardized field sobriety testing. So basically, the DUI test when you get pulled over. But these tests were designed for alcohol impairment, not marijuana, so it's a little bit different. Marijuana can have different negative effects, essentially, than alcohol does. So up top here, they're talking about the biology-based approach of basically a blood test to test the nanograms per milliliter of THC in your blood content. So they would basically take your blood, figure out the concentration of THC in your blood. And for different states have different regulations, typically between 1 nanogram to anything above 0 to 5 nanograms per milliliter of THC in your blood concentration. And important here, in a research released in 2016, the Foundation looked at data collected by DREs along with DUI arrest data. Key data points included the SFST results of nanograms per milliliter of THC in the blood. The study found that there was no objective threshold that exists that establishes impairment based upon THC concentrations measured in specimens collected from the cannabis-positive subjects placed under arrest for impaired driving. In the research, there were only minimal differences in impairment found between those with greater than 5 nanograms per milliliter and those with less than 5 nanograms per milliliter of THC concentration in the blood. Of particular note, the following findings were among those were considered impaired through SFTS. 80% had THC concentrations of 1 nanogram per milliliter or greater, and 20% had lower concentrations. And among those who were considered not impaired through SFTS, 30% had concentrations of THC over 1 nanogram per liter or greater, and 70% had lower concentrations. Therefore, a significant group of high THC levels were not identified as impaired, and some who were considered sober were identified as impaired. So in touching on the data for how bad it could be for a driver to be on marijuana or prior on marijuana, I feel like this doesn't really touch it because a lot of these studies are actually coming from whether or not professional drivers. And for CDL drivers, it's just so different because they are driving a truck for 10 hours plus. And I think the primarily negative effect of weed on that would not be the impaired judgment, rather than if we have these HOS laws where we're not allowed to drive for a certain period of time or work for a certain period of time, something like marijuana would just make you so much more tired that would just exacerbate the negative effects of driving for a long time. So I think that in taking a basically no tolerance policy to it, that further emphasizes that the HOS laws are actually important and not to be broken. Just if we're going to pretend or act like we're concerned concerned with drivers getting tired on the road and having accidents because they're tired, which those statistics show are extremely true, then we have to eliminate things like marijuana, because that will make you significantly more tired or more easy to fall asleep to have the accidents that are occurring from being tired. I think in the end of the day, like, my opinion on this really differs from, I would say, the majority of articles I'm seeing out there, or what's coming out in the surveys, where it's saying that we should have a higher allowance for marijuana in professional driving. But I think that the statistics don't properly represent how bad it would be to allow more leeway in terms of smoking. Now, granted, I do think that active testing would be a better thing, like to take a blood test. And if you are a trucking company and let's say you have an accident where someone's injured, I think that if you have a normal metabolite test, that would be worse than having the driver take a blood test in this situation, right? Because if the driver takes a blood test, then the likelihood that they fail for marijuana is far less. So the likelihood of a nuclear verdict goes down as well. Now, speaking on nuclear verdicts, I think that with regard to marijuana, if they require a metabolite test, like for the court hearing, then it's going to be still very likely that you're going to lose this nuclear verdict. And this is the situation where basically you have a driver, hits a guy, kills him, and now the family is suing you for, $5, $10, $20 million, right? So this is what the insurance companies are always trying to avoid. And in court, you're always going to deal with the reptilian theory. Basically, the opposing lawyer will come after your company or the trucking company for the emotions of, oh, look, they hire people who have failed drug tests before. This person failed their metabolite test, even though they might have smoked weed, 25 days ago. What that's going to come off to the jury is as the big company, big trucking company, as coming off as extremely negligent. So they're going to lose that case and then lose millions of dollars or not be insurable after that because of that. So I think that the thing that I took from this study was probably that it would be good to do a blood test post-accident, and that there's not going to be much that changes because of that reptilian theory. Even if the laws ease up a little bit, the court verdicts are still going to remain the same, in my opinion, because the public is not going to think that it is okay for a professional driver carrying 80,000 pounds of a load down the highway while potentially impaired on anything. We're not even allowed to look at our phones or basically be dialing and still looking on the road, let alone be on, drugs while driving. So if you're a company, the way that you practice business will not change, because the way that you practice safety as a company is going to be dictated by the insurance that you are on, not by the government's laws more so. Because half of companies can't even hire a driver with less than 2 years of experience. I also think that the driver shortage that is being claimed is not real. I think that a lot of these larger mega companies just have insane amounts of Indeed ads posted at very low pay for drivers and are claiming oh, we have 1,000 job openings for drivers making, 35 cents to 40 cents a mile. But that's not a real driver shortage. And I think anyone who's doing trucking right now and sees how restricted the market is can see that there's not a driver shortage. So I think using this point to also validate that we should lessen restrictions on marijuana for professional drivers. If you are a driver, you shouldn't want this, because that'll mean that more drivers will come into an already, in my opinion, saturated market and lower your pay. So if you are a professional driver, I would want to keep the marijuana laws to keep your job more scarce. And I think that the statistics in general are not true. I think that JB Hunt or Schneider has thousands of job ads out there for hiring drivers, but they're just going to try to hire as many people as they can at the extremely low pay rate. That's my opinion. I think that active testing would be good. I think that for trucking companies, even if the government changes laws, I don't think that it will change the ways that trucking companies operate. And I feel that for safety managers, you should still probably avoid hiring people with prior failed drug tests because primarily of the nuclear verdict. Because if you get a nuclear verdict, it's all done from there. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on the study. It's a 61-page study that I went over for a couple hours, and I think that hopefully I limited it to here about 20 minutes. But I think basically insurance companies will dictate the safety practices of trucking companies and how they hire. I don't think a government law will change that. The study shows that marijuana does impact driving in cars. I think it impacts it more in trucks because of the length of driving, and HOS laws are already in place, so we should take those seriously. And I think the primary incentive that there is a driver shortage is false, based upon the mega companies just putting out thousands of driver ads that make the statistics off. That's all. Thanks for listening. I'll put a link to the article in the description here so you can check it out for yourself. There's also tons of articles out there as well. And like and subscribe. Let me know what your opinions are, and thank you for listening.